Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. This is the second part of our program in relation to migration in UK multiculturalism. With me, I have our special guest, Mohammed Ajeeb, CBE and the first Asian Lord Mayor of the UK. Ajeeb, sir, welcome.
Thank you very much.
In the last program, we talked about how you arrived in the UK and some of your early reflections on some of the changes that were taking place. And we really came to around 1979 when some major developments were taking place around the world and more so in Britain as well. And we, just to sort of look back, we were talking about the 1979 invasion by the Soviet Union of Afghanistan, the arrival Imam Khomeini in Iran and the Iranian Revolution, and then and also the support given by the UK itself, Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan at that stage, to Pakistan in fighting off the Russians as well. So take us through, before we come back to the UK and the impact, just take us through the impact it was having on Muslim society in Pakistan and around the area, and how that impacted on society up here as well, and our relationship between Britain and that part of the world.
I think the defeat of Soviet Union in Afghanistan, coinciding with the revolution, or what they called the Islamic Revolution in Iran, did provide psychological boost to the Muslim communities globally. Because what they were saying, in fact, that we have been able to defeat one of the largest political power on earth next to America. And that is, I think, got into the heads of those mujahideens that if we were able to defeat Soviet Union's so big power, we could defeat anyone. But the West obviously left Afghanistan and Pakistan after Russia or Soviet Union went back to their lands. And they forgot all about the mujahideens and the people they trained, and they provided them with tremendous financial incentives and so on and so forth.
Because Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and all his team was trained by them.
They were all there. I mean, Osama was in the forefront of leading the Mujahideen forces against Soviets in Afghanistan. But then what happened, that when the money supply became very scanty, or totally the supply line was cut off, then those people became unemployed without any jobs. And then they obviously formulated the organization like Al-Qaeda. And somehow Osama then became a very staunch opponent of the royalty in Saudi Arabia. The monarchy he didn't approve of, because there was, I remember in those years, there was a very strong movement within Saudi Arabia which was anti the kings and so on and so forth. And they wanted to have a proper Islamic kind of system imposed in that country. So these disenchanted elements then, they got together and formulated Al-Qaeda, which became a very big threat, I think, to most of the Western countries in the next few years.
And how did you see the ongoing war between Iraq and Iran, and what impact that was having both on the Muslim communities here and throughout the world, and also how the global players were supporting and funding this?
It was planned by the American, some Western powers, because they actually wanted to get rid of Shah because there was the Communist Party there was gaining some strength with the help of the Soviet Union in those days. And they wanted to have, they wanted the regime to change, but they were trying to plant someone of their favorite. Khomeini was in exile in Paris, and they helped him to go back, and then obviously they helped his installment as the leader in Iran. But Khomeini, after a few months, he changed his plans, he changed his policies, and he said that I'm going to create an Islamic revolution. Then the West thought that he was going to be a bigger threat than the Shah.
Communists or Shah.
Yeah. Well, then they wanted to cut him or cut his power to acceptable size. They then somehow provoked Iraq's Saddam Hussein and encouraged him, as a matter of fact, and supplied him arms and other weapons and so on and so forth. And then the war started between, a long war started between the Iraq and Iran, because they gave impression to Iraq, the West, that soon Iran will become a big power in that region. And Iraq was the only country within that Arab sort of world that had some weapons, military, large army, well-trained, and so on and so forth. And the West helped them to develop further sort of arms and weapons and so on and so on within the country. And actually that war, it went on, I think, for
it was over 10 years, the longest war, I remember.
They more or less destroyed the economy of both countries, and millions of people lost their lives. And there was nothing achieved. At the end, then the West became a sort of arbitrator and tried to sort of...
I remember it was around that time when really Islam started coming into the forefront, if you remember. Before that, it was all about, minority groups and ethnic groups and blacks and prejudices and whatever. But around the late 70s, around Iran's revolution, suddenly the Muslim Islamic threat started, don't you think?
I think the Islamic revolution, as it was described by Khomeini in Iran, many other Muslim countries and the Muslims even here, they thought that that was a very actually good system and that should be replicated elsewhere in the Islamic world, because that was the first kind of religious type of government established, after Saudi Arabia, the former government there, which claimed to be revolutionary Islamic state. Yeah, and there was tremendous international publicity given to Iran for that. And yes, there was some young, I remember, Muslim even here in Britain, they were admiring that kind of system. Even when I used to go to Pakistan, people used to say, we wish that kind of revolution should be coming and imported to our country. And
I think the tragedy of that time was that one, the war, whatever the triggers were, wrong things happen and wars happen, but it went on for over 10 years with no peaceful solutions. So, in a sense, a tragedy within the Muslim world. And then the slight hypocrisy in the Western world that whilst the overall open support was given to Iraq, through the Contra deal, if you remember, a lot of armaments were supplied to Iran as well to keep the war going as well. And it's
clandestine support was provided or extended to Iran. They wanted the war to perpetuate, so that more destruction is achieved as far as the West was concerned in these two countries. So they made the two countries very weak economically and as far as their power was concerned, as far as the defense and so on and so forth.
Then we move to another major development, I suppose, in Muslim-Western relations or as UK Muslim citizens, and that was the Satanic Verses saga and Salman Rushdie. The Iran-Iraq war was coming to an end. I think the Soviets had more or less departed from Afghanistan, and probably, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, his gang, was causing chaos in that region. But Salman Rushdie wrote this novel, Satanic Verses, which was quite offensive to the Muslims. And Bradford was at the centre of the world in that, wasn't it? And you were here as well. Just take us through that period and what impact that had on English society and the relationship between Britain and the Muslims living here and elsewhere in the world.
I think Satanic Verses, when it was written and then the events that followed here in Bradford and in Britain, as far as we were concerned, I think that, in my view, that was a watershed because that determined the future relationship between the Muslims and the indigenous white people. Khomeini deliberately passed that fatwa. It was a political move. It was not really religious because he wanted to...
this was the fatwa against Salman Rushdie in April 1989,
the fatwa was that
wasn't it?
he should be sentenced to death because of his, writing.
Blasphemy.
Blasphemy and so on and so forth. Yeah. And that actually initiated a new thinking amongst young Muslims here in Britain as well. And we were just starting to go through the second generation of our young people. And they were also very much concerned with the plight of Palestine, because what they could see and read in the press and the media. So the combination of two events, the Rushdie as seen being very insulting to the Islamic faith, at the same time the killings of the innocent people in Israel, I think it was responsible, these two sort of things were responsible to radicalize the religious views of some of our young people here in Britain.
So, how do you think the establishment responded? Because there were some people who tried to say that, look, this is unfair, this book shouldn't be written, it shouldn't be supported and promoted. That was largely ignored. And as I recall, there was a book burning event which gave such a bad name to our city. But what did you think at that stage of the rights and wrongs of what was done and how it was done, both by the community and by the establishment and media?
Obviously, the establishment was very defensive of the expression of thought and speech, freedom of that expression and thought. I think the liberal elements, they were in the forefront of defending Rushdie on the TV and in the papers and so on and so forth. So it seemed that in those days that on the one hand, the Muslim community in Britain, on the other, the defenders of Rushdie, they were at loggerheads with each other. And burning of book became an international event because it was, and in this country, burning book, I mean, it's a very sensitive
took people back
issue.
to the Nazi era and all the negative images
it's very
associated with
issue,
that.
and that kind of hesitation, I think, actually made Muslims irresponsible and not sort of recognizing the freedom of speech and the expression, and I mean, in a way, the Muslims in those days began to be described as fanatics, uncompromising characters. They will never integrate. Their kind of community who will continue to cause rift and problems within the major community here in Britain. So actually that kind of thought process was initiated as a result of burning of book and other demos which took place in Britain against...
You must have been personally quite a difficult period for you, because you were a prominent member of the Muslim community. You were a major political... Because in 89 you were...
Extremely difficult, because I was still in politics, and I remember in those days I was also chairman of the Race Relations Committee on the council. Yes, it was extremely difficult for me, which way to go. Most of the time I kept quiet. I did not publicly made my views known. But behind the scene, I kept on advising the Muslim community to show some strain and constraint. And I said, you need to be seen as a community that who believes in discourse, debate, and discussion, rather than...
It was a watershed moment, wasn't it, really?
Historically,
it was tragic in a sense, because it showed, in a sense, the powerlessness of the Muslim community and the unfairness of the establishment and the media community, that which knew damn well that there was a very provocative...
One thing, I don't think the first time I'm divulging, I'm not naming names, but there was a well-known personality who lived in Pakistan, now no longer exists. She visited me for about 2 weeks, very interested in the literature and academic research. When she left, she told me, and she asked me if I know how she could get in touch with Rushdie. I found someone who had because Rushdie was living in London in those days. He had written other books, which one of them books I think I liked. It was the Midnight.
His very first one, which was most popular.
And she said, when she left my house and I said goodbye, she said, you will see a bomb shell being dropped in Britain within the next few days. And I said, what is it? She said, you will know yourself. So some people who had probably close association with him, I don't know what was going on, but later on I thought that this was a deliberate, when that book came into the market and agitation.
Oh, very much so.
There was something which was pre-planned. In order to test the water.
Yeah, I think many people feel so, because many people feel that the Iran-Iraq war was coming to an end. So you needed something else really to just test. And this time there needed to be a cultural battle and see. And I've heard that, and I probably tend to share that little bit, because given the way it was written, exactly the timing, so very much so. And were you shocked by the quite vocal attacks on Islam itself as a faith? Because obviously there were people doing silly things, and people do silly things. You can't vouch for every person. There are 1.34 billion Muslims living in a big city. There's lots of people living as well. But I was quite stunned by the direct attack on Islam itself and the Quran itself by prominent people. Were you shocked?
I was not shocked. I thought that this was forthcoming. I think after the dismantling and the collapse of Soviet Union, Muslims became a bogeyman for the West. That was the only power although very backward, but still they thought that they could impose a threat. I think the West, obviously, always, because of their political and economic might, their desire has been for the past 200 years to continue to retain that position globally and to impose their hegemony, because they defeated one of their staunch enemies, Soviet Union, and next turn I thought that I knew that it would be the Muslim community who were weaker in the sense that they were divided, but in terms of their faith and so, the history was there for the West. Historically, I mean, it's a very distinct culture and very distinct religion. They thought that we could probably deal with that in their own way.
As though if things weren't bad enough, and earlier on you said an interesting thing, you felt that there was a degree of thought and planning behind the timing.
Yeah.
This was 1989 when his book came along.
Yeah.
Along comes 1990 and 1991, and guess what happens? Saddam invades Kuwait, and there's all sorts of political thinking of what happened, how it happened, etc. But January 1991 was, for me, probably one of the most shocking phases in my life and disturbing phases when Baghdad was blitzed and attacked. What impact did it have on you? For me, I was a young man, and the heart of my culture, Baghdad, was so central to Muslim civilization being torn apart.
Well, I thought in 1991, the onslaught of Saddam on what you call it, which he invaded.
Yeah, the Kuwait, the smaller part. Yeah.
Smaller. It was a political stupidity. He was not politically prudent. He was lured into that kind of venture.
Stupidity, but lured. So there was clearly there's an element of
both.
Yeah.
I mean, you can lure a person who's not prudent enough. So he was lured into that kind of situation. He went into the trap very easily, and that trap was fixed by Reagan and Thatcher and other Western powers, and that then subsequently provided with ample justification for the West to launch the first war against Iraq, because they said, if we don't prevent him now, then the other smaller countries, particularly in the Gulf states, they will be invaded too. And then obviously they secured the essential support from those countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and so forth in Egypt. And they launched this war against Iraq.
It was interesting, prior to that, many of us Muslims and non-Muslims as well, who felt passionate about having justice in the world as well, stood up a lot for the Palestinian cause. So all the effort and all the focus used to be on, Palestine-Israel conflict, and now suddenly a new front was beginning to open up, and a major part of the Muslim world being ripped apart, and I think it had a big impact
There was wider agenda as far as the West was concerned.
Well, the oil supplies were in that part of the world, so
there were two things. One was the oil supply, because I think that Saddam, in those days, he was talking about that Iraqi oil is for Iraqi people, and he was on his way to continue to increase the oil price, because Iraq was one of the biggest suppliers of oil. And I think the danger West felt was that after weakening Iraq and Iran as a result of the very long-lasting war, Iraq was still a country within the Arab world whose people were more educated than any other country, advanced as far as the technology was concerned. They had infrastructure was better. Their army, special guards, and so on and so forth. So they posed a threat, obviously, to Israel. There was no other country because Saudi Arabia has always been clandestinely supporting.
And that's
Israel.
coming to the clear now. Now it's totally
exactly.
open.
So I think that there was a plan that they should be their economy should be destroyed, and they should be, made so weak, so that there could be no future threat against their main sort of loved one country, which is Israel, who has been serving the Western interests in that region for the past nearly 60, 70 years.
Well, I think this is probably a good place to stop, and we'll carry on with the discussion in part 2. Clearly, everything that happens has an impact on the future and how things shape up in societies and in different parts of the world and different countries. So we will deal with the period from the first Iraq war to second and then onwards in the second part. We'll be back shortly. So welcome back to the second part of this very interesting discussion. We were talking about the first Gulf War and how tragic in many ways it became. And I remember before the war actually started, I think majority of the Muslim communities took the view that we need a peaceful resolution to this, because it'd be very destructive. And even prominent figures like the former Prime Minister Ted Heath, he also felt similarly. And I remember the Sun leading the front page, traitor. I was absolutely shocked by that sort of development in the UK. What were your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, that was very unexpected kind of reaction. I never thought that a Tory leader will be labelled as being traitor. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if our current leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn...
Because the media have been after him for a long time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think...
Ted was a highly regarded, well-respected, especially by the right
within the Tory Party.
Yeah.
But I think that there are, paper like the Daily Mail, and there are some right-wing elements within the the Conservative Party and so on and so forth. They are warmongering kind of people. They believe in war rather than in peace. And probably he was victim of that kind of mentality. That still exists, that kind of mentality in British politics. We have just recently witnessed about the denigration, personal derogatory remarks against Jeremy Corbyn and so on and so forth, that he's been described as being traitor and not loyal to British values and so on and so forth. So, yes, there are some, and they will continue to exist.
I think there are really venomous attacks on Islam and the Muslim world and the Holy Quran and the Holy Prophet in every way in the current climate. And you can see, going back, retracing the roots, the grounds that were laid for that.
Well,
and
we
I
have
think
seen in Britain, for instance, it was a British... the National Front and British National Party, EDL and so on and so forth. So those kind of groups, and they are very small groups, but that kind of mentality is reflected even in Parliament by a few of people, which is not going to be helpful as far as the promotion of multiculturalism or promotion of harmony and peace amongst different communities is concerned. They are always there to disrupt any efforts which are made by some very sincere people.
Obviously, big countries and big empires have their agendas and they have their economic interests to protect and do.
Always.
But I also felt really uncomfortable and upset with the Muslim world at what was allowed to happen, what happened. What are your thoughts? Obviously, fair enough, Saddam had done wrong by taking another country, invading another country. But surely they could have done more to bring about a peaceful solution at that stage. I was deeply hurt or upset, but what about you? So you're older than me, so you.
I think the problem within the Islamic countries is they're all divided. And obviously each country then their first priority is their own internal interests of their people and so on and so forth. And most of the countries which are being governed by dictators and monarchy and so on and so forth, they are not interested in people. They are interested in the perpetual of their power, clinging to the throne and so on and so forth. So therefore, we can't see any democracy in any country in the Islamic world. They're either governed by dictators or by kings and princes and so on and so forth. With the exception of Iran, then there is, in my view, also a dictatorship, because the actual power is in the hands of the religious people, the clergy, and the power is not shared, across the board at all. So, I mean, these are the shortcomings of the Muslim countries. And I think that the West is very experienced in exploiting these deviance and these weaknesses and these shortcomings and trying to create further deviance and polarizations so that they become weaker and they don't sort of get united. Because in the Middle East, all these countries full of resources, and the biggest resource they possess is the oil. And up to now, I think oil has been the most precious commodity for the West to run their industries and then retaining their industrial muscles. So all these interests, I think that they when they are put together, then obviously then the Muslim countries have no ability to fight against some of these very highly organized, powerful nations.
I mean, obviously, when you're up against the superpower of the time and all those other nations together, there was only going to be one result. So, no surprise that absolutely Iraq got annihilated. But the fascinating thing was after the Iraqi army was defeated and Saddam was defeated, the Kurds rose up, the Shia rose up as well, but there was no helping hand to give them that support. And yet all this talk of, removing a dictator and taking a Hitler out and all that, it sort of seemed to be a bit flat. What do you think? In the first Gulf War, this was.
Yes, I mean, again, I don't think the West is interested in the welfare of the people of the Middle East. I think they're only interested in defending their own economic interests and political interests in that sort of region. They damn care for the people. They create a problem, they create wars, then they create problems of refugees and so on and so forth. Then they try to extend some aid and help. And I mean, it's ironical, isn't it? That first you say, okay, you torture someone, and then you say, okay, you die not here in the sun, but I'll put your body in shade. It doesn't make sense to me. I personally don't believe any country intervening in the domestic or the internal affairs of any other country. I think let those people decide. And we've gone through this process here in Britain. I mean, absolutely, everyone knows that there were so much animosity and antipathy between the Catholics and the Anglicans and so on and so forth. The Catholics were not even permitted to build their church and worship here in this country. But then, gradually, it's the evolutionary process through which now we have become more developed and there's more tolerance and so on and so forth. But it's the people who've done it. No one invaded from outside and told us, well, if you're fighting, then an invade, you'll destroy you, and it will teach you a lesson, and then you'll become better people. What justification the West has to make unnecessary interventions, to make unnecessary wars, unjustified, illegal wars against those countries, and then claim that we want to establish and help them establish democracy. I mean, it's nonsense. Perhaps the kind of Western democracy may not suit them for the time being, because it has taken our country nearly 1,000 years to reach this stage through evolutionary process, right? And how can one expect that those countries will become, a truly democratic nations because of the intervention and because of the teachings and because of the desire and the wishes of the Western nation? It's absolutely nonsense. It's unrealistic, and no one can justify this kind of strategy. I can't understand, other than that there's a deliberate attempt on the part of the West to continue to harass weaker nations, to create further divisions amongst them, to make them weaker and weaker, so that ultimately they sum back to their whims.
I think another really sad chapter in Muslim-Western relations was what happened in Bosnia, and especially in Srebrenica, the massacre up there. I mean, it was quite a shocking event in Europe, for God's sake, because, the West talks quite often about having an open society and democratic institutions, etc. And I would have thought, Bosnia-Herzegovina was probably one of the most open Muslim societies living in Europe. And yet what was allowed to happen in Srebrenica, 7,000 people slaughtered in front of the world's eyes. Quite shocking. What do you think?
Well, it was. I mean, what was the difference between the... to me, it was a kind of minor Holocaust, right? Everyone condemns Nazism in Germany, which is absolutely justified. And I vehemently and I abhor that kind of philosophy and the political thinking. But as far as Bosnia was concerned, hundreds of thousands of innocent people were killed, right? And then when the whole world was more or less, saying, well, enough is enough, then they said, okay, let's send some troops and try to...
But even that was when the coalition was formed between the Croatians and Bosnia-Herzegovina. I mean, I think the most difficult bit was that not necessarily that you have to send your own boys and soldiers and whatever defend, that there was an arms embargo on Bosnia. And yet the Serbs were able to get free arms of major armaments of any sort. And, there was that. And I think that, for me, was the most offensive bit, when people like Lord Owen and others, who were so eager to go into Iraq and dismantle Iraq and, depose Saddam and this, that, and other, they just would not allow open, weapons to be shipped for them to defend themselves.
You're absolutely right. I think the fact which makes me really angry is when the West applies double standards. It's one standard for one nation or one country and the other. It's simply what it suits them, and where their interests are at stake, then they will be as cruel and as merciless and as ruthless as any other uncivilized nation. I'm not talking about the internal justice here in Britain. That's different.
No, as a nation, it treats its citizens in a very nice...
When it comes to the foreign policy, then I think there are double standards. And this is one of the main reasons for growth, the homegrown, extremism here in Britain of some of the young Muslims who were born here, brought up here, educated here. But when they see this kind of injustice, against some of what they call their brothers and sisters in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, or in Palestine, then I think that they get very frustrated.
I think this has been the tragedy, hasn't it? Because
when we talk about the foreign policy, then some of our politicians say, no, it's got nothing to do with the foreign policy. It's something to do with your faith, that aggression is inbuilt in Islam and so on and so forth.
But this is the interesting test, isn't it? Because when you look at Iraq and the Middle East, you had the 1991 the first Gulf War, then a period of starvation of poor Iraqi children and others to try to get rid of Saddam, which didn't take place over many, many years, and yet all the bombing and sanctions and whatever. And then you get to the 9/11 situation.
But look, I mean, many years of economic sanctions were responsible for the unnecessary deaths of millions of children, adults, old people. Even the medicines were not available for young children. Right?
I mean, if you listen to people like Noam Chomsky, John Pilger, these are prominent people.
How one,
yes,
with any sanity and feelings for other human beings, could support that kind of policy? You know, Saddam was okay. He was dictator. He was very brutal. He was responsible for killing our own people. But then when we see that the last Iraqi war, where Bush and Blair got together, Britain, they were responsible for larger number of people's deaths, innocent people.
yes.
So what's the difference between...
And you look at the state of affairs now.
What is the difference between Saddam and Bush and Blair? To me, they're all murderers. He's been sentenced to death, he's gone. But what's about Bush and Blair? They should be tried for war crimes. Because they are responsible for the deaths of millions of people, not only those Iraqis, but since then, the killing hasn't stopped in the Middle East. Look at what's happening in, in Egypt, in Syria, in other sort of neighboring countries. So let's...
It's been a tragic development, isn't it? Because when you look at 9/11 and the so-called terrorists who carried this out were largely from Saudi Arabia. Some linkage was made clearly with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, which was bombed to a Stone Age. It was already in the Stone Age, as it was from previous wars. And then this sort of false documentation to go attack Iraq. And now look at Iraq and terrorism.
This is sheer hypocrisy and double standards. I mean, they knew, and they still know, that nearly 85% of people responsible for committing this tragedy in New York on 9/11, they were Saudi Arabian nationals, right? And why Saudi Arabia is being exempted from any action by the West, right? They are still enjoying whatever they are doing wrongs in Saudi Arabia. And the West is still supporting them because of their, again, the economic interest, because they sell, arms to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is serving the Western interest in that region next to Israel. So these are the things, and then the people, I mean, it creates frustration, it creates alienation among some of the young people.
Absolutely, and I think that's come through. And I want us to come back then from the foreign policy issues and what's happening in foreign lands to Britain itself. During the preparations for the second Gulf War, I don't know how you felt, but I certainly felt heartened with, it was, I think, over 2.5 million people, British people largely, who took to the streets to march and said, no, we won't allow you to declare war. For me, that was quite an eye-opener. At the end of it, of course, Blair did what he chose to do politically and otherwise. But what was your feeling that, there are people in this country who are willing to stand up and say, no, there's a wrong going to be done?
Of course. There are millions of people who are against war. Even now they're saying, in the parliament, I mean, the Labour Party voted against bombing of Syria and so on and so forth. We're not saying that everybody... It's the governments, the people in power, whether in America, once you get into power for 5 years and you have the majority, I mean, sometimes they operate like dictators. You make a decision because you have the majority, you enjoy that majority in the parliament, and you make a decision because you want to make it. It doesn't matter how harmful it's going to be for our country and this and that. Yes, there are some people, I mean, who are anti-war. The anti-war lobby has existed in Britain for a long, long time. And some good people. But again, look, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, when he said, I oppose this war in Syria, and how did the press play about him? What kind of...
I think that's the difficulty, isn't it? Because the political, those who have political power have perhaps an agenda, and the media also is very biased. But I think the overall British nation, British people, I think they're quite understanding through their own information that they're able to gather.
I think we in
What do you
Britain
think?
probably were more aware of what's happening in the world, more aware than the American people.
Yes.
Yeah?
I think the media in America is much more prejudicial.
still
What do you think?
The people there probably, they're not much interested in because
No.
far-flung continent, and therefore they're not much interested. Britain, but media is very powerful, and media can influence the attitudes of people. They can make wrongs right. Yes. And that's sometimes what happens here, even in Britain.
I think when you look at the first vote in relation to attacking Syria, I think it quite surprised people because when the leader of the opposition, which was Ed Miliband at that stage, they decided not to go, they reflected on what the public mood was. And the public mood was that, no, despite all the, I would call brainwashing and the media bias to say, let's do this, no, we won't allow that to happen. And that was probably one of the most positive things I've seen in this country. And that's to be encouraged. But, you know, this is where I think each citizen has got to be playing their part. But in relation to how Muslims are perceived in this country, what do you feel? Because some of the recent developments have really worried me and many other young people. What do you think?
Well, sadly, the perception of Muslim is becoming more and more negative. They are seen to be extremists, terrorists, uncompromising characters. I think the irony of this whole situation is that gradually over the years now, I mean, what would be the percentage of those who are engaged in extremism and terrorism here in Britain? Hardly, probably 0.0001%. But I think the danger is that the media and some politicians, and I've recently done an article on this subject, they are tarring the whole community with the same brush. And the impression is being created that these people will never integrate and they will always remain a threat to Britain. And obviously some of the extreme right-wing political parties, I mean, UKIP started this kind of thing before the EU elections. And there's the EDL, like the old, their predecessor, you know, the British National Party, and all these kind of people. They are busily engaged in the denigration of the Muslim community. And I think that's my biggest worry, that the next 5 to 10 years are going to be very, very difficult for the Muslim community here in Britain.
I think when you look at the prevent strategy which the government has introduced, it was introduced by the Labour government at first, trying to root out extremism. It's very limited in its thinking. Many people have been very critical, including academics and police, and that needs looking at. And the current measures being looked at countering extremism as well, I think they need looking at. What would your best sort of suggestion be of Because there's two different aspects, isn't it? There is integration of communities in this country and trying to make our cities and nation better. And clearly countering extremism of whatever sort, whether it's right-wing extremism, which many people are, or so-called Islamic extremism. Do you think they need separating out, perhaps?
I think the first thing the government and the press and the media in Britain, they need to recognize is that Muslim community, it's not sort of every Muslim is the same. There are liberal Muslims, there are some moderate Muslims, there are some extreme Muslims, and there are some Muslims who may be pursuing the idea of terrorism and so on and so forth. So they have to sort of recognize it's not sort of, you can't treat the entire Muslim community and say, let's have this formula like the prevent policy they had and then it'll cure it. No. Secondly, I think that government needs to engage in a meaningful way themselves with the Muslim community at all levels, with all thinking people, different sort of layers within the Muslim community. Yeah, if simply you concentrate on the perceived extremists and the terrorists, that yes, we need to sort of target them and try to sort of de-radicalize them and convert them into being peaceful, it's not going to work. It's the whole community on different levels. You have to sort of engage them in a meaningful way. And thirdly, I think they should stop beating the entire Muslim community with the same stick, because that is creating more alienation and anger within the Muslim community, who say, well, we are not responsible. We are peaceful people, and if less than 1% or less than even 0.2%, if they are responsible, then how can you make me to feel guilty about it? And I think that needs to be stopped both by the media and the government and the politicians.
Well, Mohammed Ajeeb, as I said, privileged talking with you. You were our first Asian Lord Mayor in the UK, setting a great example to others, and also Commander of the British Empire. Shows the respect that you've been given. And I think you give a very balanced view about the world and the sort of way we establish justice. So it's been a fascinating discussion. I think this is a great country to live in terms of the freedoms it gives us. But in terms of its foreign policy and establishing peace and justice and equality across the world, there's a lot more that it can do and a lot more that we can all do. So thank you very much.
Well, can I thank Digital Radio and say that, I've always spoken my mind, so today even I've done that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.